So hello and welcome to week 3 of DataViz Design Studio. And in this week we're going to go through how to evaluate your visualizations. How do you find out, how do you know whether you have done something that is any good? So I want to talk a little bit about usability testing first. I want to go through usability testing as kind of a refresher. What does it mean? How do we do it? Why do we do it? Before going to the context of DataViz usability testing, because, well, it was a very long year last year. Maybe some of you did this in interaction design or in design processes and methods or in another course, but maybe you could benefit from a little bit of a refresher course. But I sat down to think about what really was the way to deliver this lecture. What was the framework I wanted to use for how to teach usability? And I realized that my wife had given the lecture that I wanted to give at UNSW last year as part of an interaction design course there. So I want to talk a little bit about how you know whether your design is any good. And I would like to thank Stephanie Grace, who is much better than me at DataViz, for all of the content in this lecture. Before we dig into that, I want to talk a little bit about what the word usability means. Usability is often bemoaned, really, as a kind of an engineer's way of testing whether something is any good. You hear a lot of, oh no, we really need to go beyond usability and start doing human-centered evaluations. I think a lot of people use usability to mean measuring how long something takes. Or, page A, on average, the user takes 0.2 seconds less to get to the yes button. So therefore, page A will save us however much money. And that is awesome and important work, but of course, only a small piece of how do you know whether you've built the right thing. But really, the word usability means whether something does whatever it's supposed to do, whether it fulfills the use that you, the designer, came up with when you did your user research. You decide what your product or service will be for, and then through testing you demonstrate that it is fit for purpose. It is your purpose, your product, and your test. So from that more expansive view of usability, I think it's really important to talk about testing the usability of a thing as distinct from testing an idea or a concept. But again, as I said, while I was putting together ways to talk about this, I realized that I lived in the same house as someone who had already done this. So without further ado, Steph's lecture. It is useful to think about the whole of the product development process when talking about testing. Because the truth is, you should always be testing. Tests occur at every stage of this process. You do your initial research and an early idea emerges, sort of like a potential need, a context or a user or some technology that you believe can be used to fulfill a hole. From that, you do your user research and you move into exploring early concepts. And that's where you need to do your concept testing, which I was talking about as one of the major kinds of testing just a second ago. That's your early exploration of what is a good direction to take. You develop those concepts into a prototype. You put some detail around them, details about major flows, working end to end on a small part of the product like a key component, or putting together sort of some of the necessary interactions. But often there's a lot of missing detail about how it all fits together. That's still emerging when you're developing these products. But it's from those prototypes that you can do some kind of usability test. Because remember, in a commercial context, testing is expensive. We want to iteratively design and develop, but testing is always a very expensive proposition. Every time you spend a day testing, you take another day to get your product out to your client. So somewhere along after you've done your usability testing, you come up with a final beta version, and that goes through another round of testing, usually some kind of acceptance testing, often performed with the client. Does this product that we are ready to release to you do the things you paid us to do? But then even after your product goes through that and goes out to the customer, you continue receiving feedback, and those can be thought of as just kind of the ultimate test, right? getting it out in front of real people, and then continuing to adapt, expand, fix, update the product as you go. So you will always be testing. You will always be thinking about the next test when you're doing design in a commercial context. Our focus for today is on those two middle sections and on the difference between concept testing and usability testing and why and when you would do each of those. And then, as I said, in the next video, we're going to take that concept of usability testing in a data viz context and finally get to the questions that I'm sure you're all very interested in. How do I do the test part of assignment 1? So when you're doing concept testing, you're looking at how do we know which idea to pursue? And when you're doing usability testing, you're looking at, have I fulfilled the need that I identified that this product would fulfill? Well, of course, in order to do any testing, you need a prototype. We all know about prototypes. Hopefully, you've been learning about them for years at this point. But you know that they exist on a continuum of fidelity, from the lowest fidelity prototypes, very sketchy, fast throwaway things, often paper-based, certainly not functioning in a digital product sense, all the way, before I go to the high-end ones, here are some examples of those early paper prototypes. You might actually sketch out screens and then maybe put them into a fake device if the device context was necessary. Or rather, you can develop a very high-fidelity prototype. These are extraordinarily time-consuming, very polished, very often interactive. It might be a showpiece to end some piece of work, and it is usually aimed at the target device or target context. If it's a web app, it should run in a browser. If it's a mobile app, it should be at least clickable on a mobile. You might even be able to test them in specialized user testing rigs. Here you can see there's like a cradle that the phone is sitting in that keeps it mounted below a camera that actually captures where and what the fingers are touching to be poured over by the user testing team later. But given that we've just talked about these different stages of design, surely it's time to start prototyping? No, because I want you to think about, or rather Steph wants you to think about each step of the design process as being test first. Don't think about creating a prototype yet, because, and if you take one thing away from this video, if you take one thing away from Steph's lecture, it's this: you need to figure out what you're going to test before you can figure out what you're going to prototype. You want to prototype the things that you need answers for, because in a professional context, prototyping and testing are expensive. Anytime you're not just building the thing that you're getting paid to deliver, you are extending the time that the project will take. And so you need to do so in as efficient a way as you can. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm taking all of the creativity out of the design process here. That creativity still needs to exist, but the marvelous thing about design is that it is creativity operating under constraints. That creativity needs to spark, needs to thrive, but it still needs to be done by next Friday, right? Which gives you this marvelous interplay between thinking about things in a scientific perspective. How do I identify the things that I need to test and the quickest way to test them and discard my hypotheses and refine them, with thinking from a user-centered perspective. How do I think about the frame that the user has when they go into this question? And how do they begin to think about the interaction that I want them to have? So you're going to need to figure out what to test first. And the way to think about that is to remember that somewhere between your initial idea and whatever your milestone is your test. For concept testing, for example, you have your initial ideas, and the purpose of the test is to be able to get maybe stakeholder approval, get buy-in, people to say, yes, this is a really cool direction, let's definitely do this, or make changes necessarily to whatever your strategy is. If your concept reveals that users don't really think about it in the way you're thinking about it, then it's a great thing that you are able to discard that now at the paper prototype stage. So given that you want to achieve that stakeholder approval on your strategy, you need to think about, what do they need to know? Well, they need to answer questions like, is there potential in this idea? Which parts of it has more potentials than other? And is this strategy a good fit for the infrastructure that we have? What investment would we need to support this? What are the priorities of each of the components of this product, and would our organization need to change its structure in any way to make it a reality? It's something you see over and over again where a client loves the design for a product, but really can't envisage in reality their organization changing to revolve around it. That's how you know your thing is never going to get built. It might be a great idea, but it's never getting out of the can. So something to test at this stage is whether stakeholders are really bought into all of the things that would be necessary to make this strategy a reality. You can answer that question, think about those risks and those challenges now at the concept buy-in stage, and avoid wasting everybody's time and money. Now you would contrast this with usability testing, which is what we're actually going to be doing for this assignment. The purpose of usability testing is to iterate the design and development, to go back to the UX team and let them refine the flow, refine the structure of a prototype, but also to inform the visual design team how they need to start putting the details around the screens, and to inform the engineering and development team what they need to prioritize and what they're going to need to build. So what do each of those three components of your team need to know? Well, UX need to know is, does this concept, as it's been embedded in this prototype, actually answer or articulate or embody the value proposition? And then what parts of it will we need to change to better do so? I'll talk a little bit about the value prop as I get down to the other end of this, because obviously that's where your strategy starts. What do visual need to know? Well, in addition to knowing about color and branding and everything that they're probably already aware of, they need to know what drove someone's understanding, because they will need to make that thing visually prominent. It's no good saying, yeah, these wireframes worked because being able to see that arrow there on the left made people know where to start, and then visual don't know that and they make that arrow a light gray. Suddenly the thing that passed testing is not the thing that's getting shipped to users. What do engineering need to know? Well, now that you've got a workflow that you think articulates the value proposition, then what behaviors are part of that? What workflows do engineering need to support, and what would their data infrastructure underneath that need to be? They also need to know prioritization. Which of these things are critical and might need to go out in a first phase if this is an existing product that needs to be updated? Whereas things that are less critical might be nice to haves or might follow up in subsequent rounds. Obviously, when you're doing this in an assignment, these considerations are not really part of what you're doing. That's really the polite fiction of university, right? We pretend together that what you're doing is a perfect mirror of an industry design process, because in doing so you learn more about the industry that I hope many of you will go on to work in. But the truth is, we can't fully mirror an industry context because you're not really working on this for money, and it's not really going to be deployed. In fact, you're paying money to be here and sit on YouTube and listen to me. But what I try and do is put things in what you have to learn that best prepare you for the industry that's out there. And to do that, it's useful to think of this as part of a real design process. It's useful to think of what the questions would be that you would have to answer if you were really going to ship this product. I maintain the polite fiction for that reason alone. So you can work backwards and figure out what the test needs to do to help answer those questions. In order to inform UX on what to fix, well, what do we need to do? We need to answer the question, what aspects of our concept did resonate with users? Which ones resonated more or less? And of those, like what we required to support that. Any test that answers those questions is a good test and we can continue. Any test that doesn't answer those questions is probably just showing off or targeted at the wrong metrics. So this is what we're setting out to do, and that becomes the objectives of our study, and it's something that we can work out before we put any users in a room with our thing. So how do you set up the test? Well, you start by thinking, well, what are the things we need to measure to answer the question, what aspects of the concept resonated with users? Which parts are most important, and which parts do they understand? And then once we've answered those questions, and again, the focus here should be on the things that you are least sure of, not the things that you're most sure of. You're not testing to show off the things that you're certain about. You're testing to shore up the things that you are not yet sure of. You may have several options and you're pretty sure one of them's good, but you don't know which one is better. That place of maximal uncertainty is where you want to target your testing. So now we know what we need to measure. We know how we're going to conduct a test. We know the data we're going to collect. We know the question we're going to answer one way or another. Now we know what we're going to prototype. Now we have all of the ingredients for what we should build. We shouldn't start building any kind of in-depth, high-fidelity prototype. Sketching and concept's obviously totally fine. That happens in the previous step. We'll cover that in a second. But you shouldn't be building any kind of interactive prototype until you know what question you're going to answer with it and how answering that question is going to tell you that your product is the best possible version of that product. So this is what you build. This identifies what tools you're going to use and the context of the testing setup, because you just need enough fidelity that people can get a good sense of whatever part of your concept of the value proposition that underlies that concept that people need to start answering the question of what aspects resonated. So working backwards again, well, now we know where our prototype needs to be. Well, what do we need to do with our concept design? We need to explore different concepts and figure out how each of them address that value proposition, because then we're going to test those different concepts as they're developed in one or more prototypes. And that concept, those concepts, plural sometimes, that we're developing, well, those come from our value proposition. Those come from our understanding of what's the most critical part of this design. What's the big idea? What's the pitch? What's the 10-word version of why this is worth doing? How does it provide value, monetary, social, personal, whatever value, to its stakeholders? Where does that strategy come from? Well, that comes from your user research. That's why you conduct user research. You need to understand your audience, your context, the journeys that you want them to go through, their pains, their gains, their loves, their losses, their fears, because that helps you understand or formulate that value proposition, that framing and that key idea from which your concepts derive, and then from which your prototypes derive, and then from which your answers derive. So you need to do this backwards in some sense. You need to look at the before and after of each step and understand where it's coming from. Because most importantly, you're not just doing these things because. You're not just doing them because you're told that they're the steps of a design process. You're doing them because each one gets you closer to certainty that you've built the best possible thing. Your research informs your strategy informs your concepts inform what you're going to test, which informs what you're going to prototype, which informs the kind of synthesis you do, which informs the kind of answers that you get, which allows you to tell your stakeholders, yes, we are sure that this is good and we can move forwards. If you follow these steps, if you follow Steph's 7 steps, and she may hate me for calling them that, and you understand how each part of the design process is informed by the one before it and informs the one coming after it, then it makes perfect sense to put together a usability test. Because what a usability test is doing is saying, is this design doing what I expect? Are people feeling about it the way I expect them to feel? Are they understanding the central framing, the way things are put together? And are they drawing out the conclusions that I want them to draw? Whether it's in a data viz or any other kind of interactive product. And then once you can answer those questions, you're sure that you not only have a product that is valid in that it does what you expected it to do, you've validated that it does what it says on the tin, but that it's also valuable because what you built into it from the concepts that you put together are derived from the value proposition that is itself derived from the user research that you did. These are not just magic words. These are not just spells that you have to cast in order and remember to swish and flick. That might be too old of a reference. Again, my students are always younger than I expect. But these things are a process that informs each of the next steps. And in thinking about it that way, it'll be easier to understand what and why we test for data viz. And that'll be the focus of our next video. So thanks everybody, please, to Stephanie Grace, my wife, who better understands how all of this fits into an industry context than a lifelong ivory tower bound academic like myself. Thank you very much for the use of her slides and her words. And I'll see you in the next video when we're going to talk about what this all means in a data viz context.